Well, as I said this morning, I love the Lord of the Rings movies. I mean, the books as well. I read that, BBC radio play and the books before ever the films were out. But I do love the films. They might not be perfect, but as adaptations go, they're about as well done as they could be. The filmmakers, Peter Jackson and others, they paid such careful attention to every last little detail. I mean, literally down to the leaves on the trees, or at least the leaves on one tree. And it's sweet. If you look at the behind-the-scenes documentary, excuse me, you hear about all the lifelong friendships that developed on set, and maybe you've seen footage of the four main Hobbit actors who still meet together as friends. The actor who played Aragorn, Viggo Mortensen, he developed such a bond with his horse that he bought it. He made friends with his horse. The hobbits made friends with each other. He made friends with the horse. But if you're not familiar with it, I don't know if you all are, the story is all about one hobbit, Frodo Baggins, and his quest to take the One Ring to Mordor to destroy it in the fires of Mount Doom. Frodo is the humble hero of the saga, no question. He's an ordinary person who achieves extraordinary things. But when you watch those films, you probably need to set aside a few days, because even if you just watch the cinema release, not the extended edition, they're quite long. But if you think about those films, do you think you'd have been disappointed to be one of the supporting characters? You miss out on getting the Frodo ring, because Peter Jackson just thinks Elijah Wood's got the right face for it. That role's gone, but then you get cast as Aragorn, or you get cast as Legolas, or Gandalf, or Sam, or any of the other great cast of the Fellowship. Now, the story's not going to be all about you, even if you make it onto the movie poster. I don't know if you remember some of the posters, and you had Frodo there in the middle, and he's holding the ring, and he's in the centre. The spotlight isn't on you. You're just one of these faces around. Now, do you think any of those supporting actors regretted that they only got to be a supporting actor in that series? I don't know how much money each of them made from it. I imagine it's a lot. And they got to be part of one of the biggest, and I would say the best, film trilogies of all time. Now, surely it's better, isn't it, to be a bit player in a series like Lord of the Rings than get the leading role in a lousy film that no one's ever heard of. Isn't it better? Isn't that a better feather in your acting cap? Well, let's get on to Joseph. Joseph bar Jacob. Joseph, son of Jacob. This quiet, righteous man. A hero of the faith. I think he should be a personal hero of every one of us. Jesus' father, faithful and obedient. And it seems content to be a supporting character in the story that God is telling through Jesus. Because for all that he is active and he's important in this chapter, I mean, there's a lot that hinges, it seems, on his obedience to the commands he receives. This is the most detail, by the way, that we get about Joseph anywhere in the Bible. There's next to nothing anywhere else compared to this. But for all that, the story's not about him, is it? We're going to see what God is doing here. Well, we just use Google Maps these days, don't we? But once upon a time, you had to use maps to get places, and you'd end up lost, inevitably. And sometimes you hit a patch of road as you're driving, and you think you're finally heading in the right direction, and then one of your passengers says, I think we've been this way before. And if you want a heading for my first point, that's probably a good one. Because when you read Matthew 2 and Matthew 1 and Matthew 2, you should very much be getting that same, I think we've been here before feeling. Because having been looking as we have at the books of Genesis and Exodus over the past few weeks, we read this chapter in the New Testament, and we should start getting deja vu. You know, Matthew, as I said, he's writing to a Jewish audience. And unlike your average self-identifying Christian these days, the average Jewish person in the first century, man or woman, knew their Bible. All right, they would have memorized whole chunks of it, and large passages were read out every Saturday as they worshipped God in the synagogue. They knew their Bible, they memorized it. And they knew how it all fit together. Even the bits they couldn't know word for word, they knew what happened. This was the stories of their people. This is the history of their family. So they were deeply invested in it, and they knew it. So when Matthew here in the New Testament seems like he's cribbing plot notes from the Old Testament, that's because he wants his predominantly Jewish readers to be drawing the connections back into the Bible so that they can project forward in the plot what should be expected. You know, given those connections, and that might just be so that we know where the story's heading, so we know where it's going to end, or so that he can surprise us with the unexpected. And you see that a lot in books like Genesis, where a sort of a pattern is repeated in the story, and sometimes that's sort of like, oh yeah, I know where this is going to end. And sometimes it's, so you're like, oh, I think I know this. And then it doesn't end where you think it's going to end. And it's using this type scene to get us to read a story and invest in it differently. We're going to point out the connections. I mean, my tongue-in-cheek sermon title for this and last week is Joseph by Jacob, and then in brackets, know the other one. Because Jesus' father, Joseph, is the son of a man named Jacob, and we get that in the genealogy in chapter 1. And he's not the first Joseph, son of Jacob in the Bible, is he? Not like I mentioned last week, and you already know, there's a Joseph bar Jacob in the book of Genesis, the favourite son of Israel who earns the hatred of his brothers. I think, in fact, I'm sort of jumping ahead a bit, but when we get that reading, or that quote from the prophet Jeremiah that talks about Rachel's sons. Well, that's referring to Joseph and Benjamin and the tribes descended from them and then being carted off into exile. Other than the preferential treatment that this Joseph got from Jacob for being the first son of his favourite wife, Rachel, and remember, this is before Benjamin's born, and so he just shows how much he loves Rachel and how much he loves Joseph. In front of all the other children, Joseph gets a favourite treatment until Benjamin comes along, and then he gets it. It's demonstrated so unfortunately, isn't it, in that noble coat, or that coat of many colours, or have it translated in your Bible. But do you remember, what was it that got Joseph's brothers so worked up that they end up selling him into slavery? Can you remember what it was? You can put your hands up or shout out, I don't mind. It was the dreams. Spot on. It was the dreams he had. Dreams, not just any old dreams, but dreams that the rest of his family would bow down to him. When the brothers plot to murder him, and they end up not following through on that plan, just selling him into slavery, but when they're planning to kill him, they say, here comes that dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. That's Genesis 37. Now remember how later in the story, with God's help, Joseph correctly interprets what? The Pharaoh's dreams. And even before that, he interprets the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker while he's still in prison. It's chapters 40 and 41. It's Joseph's appropriate response to dreams that leads to the saving of the lives of the entire known world as he helps Pharaoh prepare for the terrible famine that ravages the land. And it's fleeing that famine that causes Jacob's family, or Israel's family, to go down into Egypt, where Jacob is finally reunited with his long-lost son, the son he thought dead, Joseph. Now, Jesus' father, Joseph, here in Matthew 2, is another righteous man, and as I said last week, that's a good comparison, isn't it? Joseph 1, should we call him? The first Joseph in Genesis, or Genesis Joseph, he's righteous. And we see that in the way he acts, in his conduct, both, I think, towards Potiphar's wife and Potiphar, and then to the cupbearer, and to Pharaoh himself, and even to his brothers, when you look at how they've treated him. We could discuss that some other time. And Jesus' father, Joseph, is another righteous man. But he's not only a righteous man, is he? He receives dreams from God. And he ends up going to Egypt in less than happy circumstances. And there's more. Because this story, I think it should, but it doesn't just remind us of Genesis. You skip ahead 400 years of that Egyptian sojourn into Exodus, and then there's a Pharaoh who doesn't know about Joseph. And he oppresses the Israelites harshly. He fears losing power if Israel sides with his enemies. Do you remember when we read it a couple of weeks ago on a Sunday night, and Pharaoh's daughter and the Hebrew midwives even, he's concerned that enemies will come in, foreign powers will come in, the Israelites will side with him, and he'll get kicked out. Which, it's possible that that's how we got in the first place, and that's why he didn't know about Joseph. He was a foreign dynast who'd come in and taken over. And so he ordered as a response that male children of Israelites should be murdered, thrown into the Nile. That plan doesn't work out so well, does it? And we read in Exodus 2, verse 23, he dies. And he's replaced by a son who seems almost as wicked and stubborn and dangerous for God's people. And here in Matthew chapter 2, we have Herod the Great, terrified of losing power. And Herod was a paranoid man. And he had, I think, some of his own sons and grandsons executed because he was concerned they were plotting against him. They probably were. But just think, what an attempt to hold on to power, that you'll start killing your own family just for the sake of having a crown on your head for a few more years. And so to keep hold of that power, he will order the slaughter of male Israelite children. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? What happens to him? Exactly what we expect will happen to him. He dies, and he's replaced by his son, Herod Archelaus, who seems almost as bad and stubborn and wicked as him. Bad enough that Joseph is warned in a dream to stay well clear of him and his sphere of influence. Now, quoting the prophet Hosea's comment on it, Matthew draws a clear parallel with God saving the nation of Israel from Egypt, with Joseph and bringing Mary and Jesus back to the land of Israel. Out of Israel I called my son. I think we've been this way before. But let's keep going. It doesn't happen often, but sometimes, just sometimes, and I looked this up on IMDb and Wikipedia and stuff, and just read it, just like, what remakes are better than the originals? It's mostly films where the first one wasn't that good in the first place. But sometimes a remake is better, and that's our second heading. Sometimes the remake is better. Maybe it's the special effects, or the better actors, or like I say, because the first one wasn't that good. Or you get a director who just understands the source material better, and he's able to retell the story better. Lord of the Rings is, at least the Fellowship of the Ring, that's actually a remake, sort of. Because there was an animated version of just the first one that never quite worked or took off, so you can go research that later. For whatever reason, there's something about it that kind of justified making a remake. There's all kind of remakes that are just rubbish, and they just make them to make a quick money. But sometimes, from that mess of mediocrity, you get something that really stands out. Now, if Matthew is describing Jesus' story as a remake of what's happened earlier in the Bible, we need to think about why, don't we? Why is he doing that? expectations is he playing on? Why is he setting this up very clearly to retell stories we've already read in the Bible? Now, he's selective in the way that he tells the story. He draws out the similarities and he minimizes the differences. But he's just describing the reality of what's happened. He's not making anything up. This is just how God has worked. This is what God has caused to happen. So this isn't just what Matthew is trying to tell the Israelites, the Jewish readers of Matthew's gospel. This is what God is trying to tell everyone who is paying attention. Because when Matthew draws parallels to the start of the Exodus story, think about where that story starts and where that story ends. Because it ends with God humiliating Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. It ends with God bringing Israel out of Egypt, out of their slavery, with the plunder of the Egyptians, and bringing them to him at Sinai. And if you look at the book of Exodus, it's about Sinai. It's just like chapter after chapter after chapter at Sinai. You know, the author, is it Moses? He will skip over like decades of history and then just Sinai. It's all about Sinai, where he covenants with them, he gives them the law, he adopts them as his people, and he makes them a nation. It's like their constitution, their founding as a nation at Sinai. So when Matthew is replaying the earlier scenes in the movie, because it's a remake, we know how it's going to end, don't we? So already, by Matthew 2, we should know where this story is going. Now, if you remade The Lord of the Rings, and I don't bother doing it because they already made it as good as we're going to get it, but if you did, and you didn't have the one ring being destroyed at the end, spoilers, you are telling the story wrong. Like, that's just not how it goes. This story is going to end with God saving his people from slavery and foreign oppression. It's going to end with the giving of a law. It's going to end with the founding of a nation, the start of a new covenant. A whole new way of relating to God, which promises blessing. He is setting up the events of his gospel as pivotal to the nation of Israel as Sinai was. That's exactly what Matthew is doing. This story might start with death, but it's going to end with life. But this is what might have been a bit weird to the Jewish audience that first read this gospel. Because let's think about the casting decisions that Matthew's gone with here. Because in the role of Joseph, who's brought Israel safely out of Egypt, or into Egypt, and then sort of prophesies they're coming out of Egypt. So playing Joseph, we have Joseph. Joseph bar Jacob, played by Joseph bar Jacob. It's straightforward enough. Now, this is why actors, they're not allowed to have the same screen name, are they? Because it could get confusing. So they've all got to have different names. Joseph plays Joseph. And that's good casting. He looks like him. He's very similar to him. He's plausible in the role. But playing the role of the nation of Israel, and, in the original, this was somewhere around 1 to 2 million people. That's kind of, if you look at the lists of names we have and the numbers we get in Exodus, we could put it somewhere between 1 to 2 million people. They went into Egypt about 70. They came out 1 to 2 million people. And playing that entire nation, cast in that role, we have Jesus. One man. That's weird, isn't it? So the equivalent in the story of the nation of Israel, we have Jesus. Now, I don't know if you've seen, is it Cecil B. DeMille who made the Ten Commandments, that classic biblical epic? I think when it was made, it was one of the biggest casts ever in any film. Just thousands of people out there to represent the nation of Israel at Sinai. Now, if Cecil B. DeMille wanted to save a bit of money, he should have done what Matthew did. Why bother with all those thousands and thousands of extras when you could just cast one man? Right, it's weird, isn't it? One man as the nation. A nation is 1 to 2 million people. That we get. It's a cast of thousands of people. One man, that's weird. Now, Matthew has already stated that Jesus is the Messiah. He says that in chapter 1. He is God's anointed saving king. So, okay, Jewish people are happy with that. The Messiah, he's the king. David was the Messiah. Saul was the Messiah. The king, he's God's anointed king over the nation. He's a king over the nation. But Matthew has added another dimension to the work that Jesus is coming to do. You know, that quote from Hosea in verse 15, it originally referred to all Israel as God's son. So God's son is the entire nation. But here it's applied specifically to Jesus. Because that's who he's talking about, isn't he? In this, when he brings out of Egypt Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. And it's about Jesus. It's applied to the Son. It's applied to Jesus. Now, if you look ahead to verse 18, that quote from Jeremiah that I mentioned just before, it's originally about a lamentation over the exile. Like I said, the tribes descended from Rachel. So, you know, the tribes descended from Benjamin and Joseph, so Ephraim and Manasseh, more northerly nations who went into exile first. And it's about that, a grief that in that passage in Jeremiah, if you read a little further on, God promises to heal by bringing back from the nations they've been exiled to, all these people. So to a Jewish mind, Matthew's added in a whole other bunch of connections about where this story ends. Because this isn't a play-for-play remake, is it? He's improved on the story. Because the Exodus ended with a law and a covenant that Israel could never keep. And so they kept being handed over to their enemies because that was the terms of the covenant. If you sin, if you go after foreign gods, you'll be handed over to your enemies. It's in the contract. They knew it was going to happen from Sinai onwards. But God had promised to make a new covenant that, as Jeremiah says, will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors. It's not going to be a covenant that could be broken, that relied on their obedience in order to guarantee blessing. It wasn't going to be a covenant that brought condemnation for disobedience. It was going to be a covenant that guaranteed blessing by giving people a new heart. A covenant that would be sealed in the perfect sacrifice that God, not us, would make. Matthew is making clear that Jesus is the fulfillment of all God's promises to Israel. In fact, he is the fulfillment of all God's promises to Abraham, where Matthew starts his genealogy. In fact, we should know, as the connection to Genesis and Exodus helps us to see, he is the fulfillment of God's promises to all mankind. Herod and Pharaoh are not just wicked kings. They are showing they're of the line of the serpent. In fact, fun little fact, the Pharaoh on his crown actually had a serpent. Did you know that? I don't know that Herod did. Jesus is the one who will crush the serpent's head. He is the one who will undo the curse and wipe away every tear. He is not just the king of the nation. He is the nation that God will favour. Now, you think of Israel in the wilderness, and we like to look down on them. And we know if we were in the same place, we'd be exactly like them. That they're always just disobedient. And God covenants with them as a nation. And so the entire nation suffers where some of the nation sins. Because that's the arrangement. It's like you're going to be blessed as a nation and you'll suffer the consequences as a nation. So there'll be people who suffer famine and exile who didn't do the sins for which they've been sent into exile, but as a nation they're being treated as a nation. Because when you have a nation that's full of sinners, you get the consequences of that. What about if you have as a nation one perfect and perfectly obedient man? And it's on his behavior that blessing depends. Well, the consequences of the first situation are disastrous, aren't they? The consequences of the second are perfect. It's just guaranteed blessing. If we want to enjoy the favour and blessing of God, we don't get it by being circumcised into the first situation. We don't get it by joining national Israel. You've got to keep the entire law. You're not going to do it. There'd be blessing if you did, but you're not going to. If we want the favour and blessing of God, we are joined to Jesus. We enter a relationship with him, and we are guaranteed the blessing of his perfect obedience. Don't we see why it's worth learning the Old Testament? Because without it, the New Testament doesn't make sense, and we can't see or understand the wonderful ways that God works in human history, and the wonderful and much better and deeper and richer salvation that he offers us in Jesus. Sometimes the remake really is better. Joseph was content to be involved as a supporting character, and he played his part perfectly. I think he's better casting even than the first Joseph. He committed to it. Now, when he takes his family to live at Nazareth, that is, I think, a suggestion of quite how committed he was to God's saving plan through Jesus. And repeatedly, I want to sing the praises of Joseph as just what a guy. Because when the message comes from God, doesn't matter what time it is, he goes and does it, doesn't he? So the first time, don't be afraid to take Mary as a wife. He's going to go and do it. Next thing we read he does, he goes and takes Mary as his wife. When he gets a message in the middle of the night, take the child and your wife to Egypt, he gets up in the middle of the night, and that is what they do. No matter that, that's not the time you set out on a journey. It might be when you've got to get to Manchester Airport for 3 a.m. or something, you get up in the middle of the night. But they didn't do it in those days. They didn't have street lighting. You travelled in the day, and then you stopped at night because it wasn't safe. But when God says go, he goes. He is obedient, and he's immediately obedient. He doesn't muck about. He doesn't prevaricate like I would. He doesn't come up with all the excuses to put it off. He just does it. Joseph is a good guy. But I think he declares the faith in the promises given to him through his actions. I'll come into a close here, but Nazareth, I love this, it means branch. And, where it says in verse 23, and so was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. You can search through your Old Testament, you're not going to find that prophecy. There is no one prophet who says, and the Messiah will be called a Nazarene, or anything like that. It's just not there. That's why Matthew doesn't say the prophet so-and-so, because he's not quoting a verse, he's quoting a word. It's that word Nazareth, branch, one of the repeated titles of the Messiah, the righteous branch of David. It's in Jeremiah, it's in Isaiah, it's in Zechariah, it's throughout. Now, we're not told that Joseph was ordered in a dream to go and live there. It just says he went and lived there. He's told where he shouldn't go, and then he makes a decision about where he should take his family. And he goes to Nazareth, to a town named messianically by returning exiles that believed that God would send a branch of David. It's a declaration on the part of Joseph that he trusts God, that he is aligning with God's plan. He acknowledges his son is the Messiah, And he will continue as he raises Jesus to play his part, however lowly it might be, in the story that God was telling. It can be a humbling realization, can't it, to discover that you are not the star of the show. That you're not centre stage, that the universe, whatever Disney tells us, doesn't revolve about you. All human history, not just the New Testament, all human history, from the garden to the grave, is about Jesus. It's not about us. I mean, that's funny, because human history isn't really about humans. Of course, it's because of the incarnation, but that's a whole other thing. We are part of his story. He receives the glory. It's not about us. But isn't that wonderful? Isn't it a little like being a supporting actor in The Lord of the Rings? Only better. Not just being part of something cool, at least that nerds think is cool, but being part of something of eternal significance. Better to be a background character in that story than be star of our own story when it is not in our power to secure a happy ending. Because that's the problem. If you were the star of the show, then what about all your mistakes? What about all your failings? And what about when the story doesn't go quite how you want it to? It's just a rubbish story then. But if you were part of a wider story with a master storyteller in charge, who does have the power to give it a happy ending, will we, like Joseph, commit to the wonderful roles that God has prepared for us and align ourselves, like Joseph, our lives, our plans, our every work and decision, and the way that we respond to God's commands? Will we align all of it with him? Do we realize the great privilege of being part of his story? And do you know that it's in Jesus, it's only in Jesus, that a happy ending is not just possible, but it's certain. Let's sing our final hymn. Joy has dawned upon the world, promised from